Good morning from Nairobi. I just wanted to touch on a report that Portland Communications put out called How Africa Tweets in 2018. I thank them for the shout out that I received around being an influencer here in Kenya, but there was a lot of content which was very interesting. Portland's fourth study into how Africa tweets has found African governments are not immune from global issues such as fake news, the rise of bots, and external influence on elections. Portland's study is the first to identify and analyze who is shaping African Twitter conversations during elections over the past year. The study found that 53% of the leading voices on Twitter around 10 elections on the continent during the past year came from outside the country in which the elections were contested. Bots and accounts displaying machine-like behavior were active across all elections, particularly in Kenya, where they accounted for a quarter of all influential accounts. One of the more surprising findings from the study was the limited influence politicians had on the conversation. Rwanda was the exception, where 1 in every 3 influential handles was a political account, the highest figure across all elections analysed. This doesn't mean politicians weren't being talked about. Many of the top hashtags included references to politicians or political parties, including Uma Angola para Todos in Angola, Where in Liberia, and Kagame in Rwanda. Therefore, influencing narratives now also requires getting inside the loop, going to where people are, rather than them relying on coming to you. In Kenya, bots accounted for a quarter of influential voices. Rwanda was the opposite, with bots accounting for just 4% of influential voices. Non-domestic news outlets and journalists accounted for 1 in 5 of the handles, fueling discussion and debate around the year's elections. Senegal was one of the only countries where local influencers dominated election discussions, comprising almost 72% of handles tweeting on the election. Senegalese journalists and news organizations were the leading influencers, accounting for a quarter of all handles. Rwanda was one of the few countries where local influencers drove the debate, with 77% of influential accounts based in the country, so they own their own narrative. Of the journalists and news organizations identified as influencers, 77% were based in Rwanda. It was a similar story with the political and governmental accounts identified as influential, with 93% based in Rwanda. Journalists and news organizations comprised 1/3 of the influential Twitter handles tweeting on Kenya's August election. Bots accounted for about a quarter. Business leaders accounted for 10% of handles. The vast majority of influential accounts were Kenyan. Of the bot and business accounts identified, 89% and 86% of the respective accounts were Kenyan. The majority, 57% of journalist and news organization accounts, were located in Kenya too. So that's an interesting development. Business leaders joined in the conversation, mostly around Kenya Decides, and focused their tweets on discussions around the presidential debates, the importance of Kenyans having a choice in the election, as well as offering praise to government officials. Journalists and media professionals and news organizations accounted for 51% of influencers during the Angolan election. Bots were second, representing 9%. Business leaders and professionals were third. Liberian election was the only election in which the host country did not even rank in the top 10 most popular locations of influencers. Instead, influencers from the US, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya drove the debate. A similar story was found when analyzing the leading media outlets, with almost 98% based in neighboring countries, Europe or the US. As was the case during the August general election, journalists and news organizations represented the leading influencers, accounting for 30% of influential handles. Every bot account identified as an influencer was observed to be based outside the country or with an unknown location, with none featuring their location in Equatorial Guinea. This was the same for journalists and media accounts identified as influential. Somaliland, over 98% of journalists and news organizations identified as influencers were observed to be based outside the country. This was among the highest score recorded across the African elections analysed. Very interesting report. Do go into the PDF to get a flavour of all those individual countries we're discussing. Very fascinating. I still think that social media is a game changer, and governments are not going to be able to snuff it out. They have to find better ways of understanding the comment, and it should inform them better about how to govern.